After nearly 25 years, it's hard to say anything new or surprising about The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Nearly everyone who could have made an article or video about the game has done so already, and I do mean everyone. So it's likely not the best idea to make yet another video about the game. But the discussion around Ocarina of Time still somehow remains interesting all these years later. People still want to talk about this game. And for good reason. What's more impressive is that while discussion of this game is everywhere on the internet, you can easily find a unique perspective that can alter your viewpoint ever so slightly. Which isn't me saying that this is what this video will be. I have no real way of knowing if what I'm about to say will sound new to you. But what I can say is that I, myself, have had my own viewpoints on Ocarina of Time challenged over the last few years. Some parts of the game have really not aged so well, but it still manages to captivate me in all the same ways. Ocarina of Time hits me the hardest in that nostalgic soft spot than any other game in the series. But for this video, I am going to try my best to throw all of my childhood memories into the bin. I'm going to look at this game in a slightly more objective way. I still think there's lots here to love, but time is rough, and Ocarina of Time is starting to really show its age. But before we do anything else, I had to make a tough choice when making this video. I could either play the original Nintendo 64 version or the 3DS remake. The 3DS version of the game mostly brings aesthetic changes, which, in my opinion, make the game much nicer to look at. There are also a few mechanical differences here and there, but for the most part, it's still got the meat and bones of Ocarina of Time. But for the purposes of this video, I've decided to stick with the original game. I feel like I have plenty to say about the 3DS version and the changes that it brings to the table, and I'd rather make that a separate video of its own at some point. So what I'm playing here is the original Nintendo 64 1.0 version of Ocarina of Time running through an emulator. You may notice small visual bugs here and there, but for the most part this was the best way of playing through the original title without changing too much of the original experience. It's fair to say that Ocarina of Time was pretty ambitious for 1998. It had the difficult task of creating a deep and enthralling world set in a fully 3D space, which had been done before this in some games, but not quite to this exact scale and quality on a home console. It also had the tough job of redesigning Zelda for the new 3D style, and it wasn't really a question of simply copying what the previous mainline game had done. A Link to the Past and early 2D Zelda in general obviously plays entirely differently to its 3D counterpart. We are working with a completely different set of rules here, and that definitely caused some problems in certain areas. We can also attribute most 3D open world design quirks as we know them today all the way to Ocarina of Time, since it was really the first to do them this successfully. And because of that, it is very easy to poke at some of its problems. But let's not get it twisted, Ocarina of Time is a seriously impressive game even now. Alongside kickstarting open worlds as we know them today, Ocarina of Time also revolutionized the Zelda franchise itself. And if there's someone watching this who doesn't quite know who a Zelda even is, I'll give you the quick rundown. The Legend of Zelda is a series where our hero Link has to explore the world of Hyrule and its various nooks and crannies. Maybe he'll bomb a tree or two, or voluntarily fall into enticing holes in the ground. But this is all in order to gain the equipment and experience he needs to eventually take down the big bad guy at the end. That is basically the gist for every Zelda game in the franchise, but Nintendo rarely likes to shake the boat too much with all of its IPs. Mario jumps, Kirby sucks and has a great time doing it, Samus is a kleptomaniac with ADHD, and Captain Falcon hasn't been seen since 2003. Can we please, where is he? Can we find him please? I need another F-Zero game, please. And sure, we have things like freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Ruby Land, but I mean, come on. Mainline Zelda is something that rarely undergoes much of a change, but it's within that mold that some games can surprise you. It was Ocarina of Time's job to take that Zelda DNA and apply it to a truly 3D environment. But with all first steps, you're bound to trip up at some point, and you can start to feel some of the game's problems right off the bat. The control scheme here is pretty unusual for a 3D action game by most standards. By far the strangest quirk is that there is no jump button. Instead, Link has to run off obstacles and he will jump automatically. This is strange, especially when you think about how much of the game revolves around careful platforming. There's also no camera control since the N64 only had the one stick, so you'll be pressing the Z button to recenter the camera whenever it's somewhere you don't want it to be. If there is one word that I would use to describe the game feel in Ocarina of Time, it would be sluggish. Link feels really heavy when you're just running around. In fact, doing almost anything in the game feels strangely slow. Navigating the menu, equipping and using items, pushing blocks, throwing bombs, aiming your bow, it all feels weighty in a way that doesn't necessarily feel great. Thankfully, the game rarely needs you to move and react with a pace greater than Link can supply, so it doesn't get in the way of actually playing the game. It still just doesn't feel great though. These small problems don't get much better when you need to trek across Hyrule Field early in the game. It's not very exciting, let's just say that. There's a reason people just press the roll button in these games. It feels more engaging than just holding up on the stick. Link is just lucky that Kojima didn't make this game, otherwise you know he would make Link throw up after his 7th consecutive roll. A fun quirk is that sidestepping or walking backwards while Z-targeting is about twice as fast as Link's usual running speed. Once you start doing that, you'll find that getting around is a little less time-consuming. Other aspects of the controls still feel pretty good. Swinging Link's sword feels satisfying, and combat in general serves its purpose. Link has a simple 3-hit sword combo, which has different animations depending on how you move the stick while pressing B. These are all mostly for flavor, but I can't lie, the stab attacks feel pretty good to land. Link also has a spin attack, which is very underwhelming at the start, but later he can upgrade it to cover a much wider area. Then there's the jump attack, which often feels like the best way to end an encounter, with Link putting all his strength behind one strike. Combat isn't mind-blowing or anything, but it works. Now, if you wanted to get really granular, I would say that a game's combat is only as good as its enemy design. And that's where most of this game's issues in combat lie. Broadly speaking, most enemies are fine, if not fun to fight. The highlights include the Stalfos, which feels like a fight against an equally skilled foe as you both stare each other down looking for an opening. Then there's the Iron Knuckle, a big brute that can do a lot of damage, and as you chip its armor down, it gets quicker. I also like the Lizalfos, which is pretty simple to beat. You just block its attack and strike back with your own and rinse and repeat. But these encounters are still satisfying. I think a lot of this game's negative discussion does revolve around the combat. Some people don't like the fact that most of these enemies simply require you to wait until there's an opening. And sure, it can be kind of awkward to just stand there and stare at each other, but I don't know, I think these encounters actually work pretty well for the most part. Plus, it's not like you're going to be fighting them every 5 minutes. The problems start when the game pits more frustrating enemies at you. Keese are one of the more annoying enemies since the Z-targeting sometimes prefers to not work at all. More often than not, it's easier to just wait for them to come to you and start spamming the spin attack. If you're feeling fancy, it's more than doable to hit them with the bow manually, and honestly, it's pretty satisfying if you can nail it, but this is extremely awkward to do. Manually aiming the bow or the slingshot is very difficult, but since I'm playing through an emulator and not with the official controller, I am not sure if it feels better on an actual N64 gamepad. Redeads are, in concept, a cool and terrifying enemy to fight, but in practice, these things are annoying. They can freeze Link and latch onto him, which slowly sucks away his health. So fights end up being this annoying dance. It takes forever to just take one of them down if you do end up getting frozen. And yeah, this enemy could also be an example of the waiting problem I just mentioned earlier, but the problem is more that all control is taken away from you when you're frozen, rather than it being about waiting for an opening to strike. But when the game starts getting creative with enemies is when I start to like the combat again. Wallmasters are a really cool enemy that slowly descend on Link from the ceiling, and when they grab you, they can throw you back to the start of the dungeon. They are creepy, engaging, and an encounter that takes a bit more thought to deal with. But circling back a bit, the general game feel is clunky, but manageable. Link's sluggishness combined with the awkward camera and strange quirks of the movement can make acclimating to the game a challenge, but once you do, I don't think the controls are all that bad. And that's important considering every other 3D Zelda game has basically the exact same control scheme. Obviously, there are improvements, but 3D Zelda was beholden to Ocarina of Time's way of doing things for a while. But what about the world itself? How is exploration handled? Well, Hyrule is a vast and varied setting with plenty of different biomes and locations to visit, from the hazy forest in Kokiri Village to the wide open Hyrule Field. And then there are the homes of the Gorons and Zora. Each location feels visually distinct from each other, and that's something that should be commended. They're decently sized too. They managed to strike the balance between being big enough to hold some secrets and small enough to make them easy to explore. Some of Hyrule's other locations sometimes struggle to be as visually impressive though. Building interiors are a major culprit of this, since most of them are just a blurry pre-rendered image. And obviously this is more of a consequence of playing the game in HD, but since Ocarina of Time is now available on the Switch in HD, this is an unavoidable problem for some. The overworld also struggles to make its locations visually engaging sometimes. Hyrule Field is quite literally just a big field, with not much going on at the best of times. On the flip side, some locations are still visually great to look at. Zora's fountain is beautiful, with light bouncing off the water and reflecting onto the surrounding cave. Some of the dungeons in the game ooze so much atmosphere that it's impossible to say that this game looks ugly all the time. Hyrule also holds plenty of mysteries for Link to discover. First up, there are the heart pieces dotted all over Hyrule. When Link finds 4, an extra heart is added to his life meter. It's a simple collectible, but one that holds a lot of value for the player. A lot of the time, the way to get a heart piece isn't very straightforward. You might just need to talk to an NPC in a unique location, or make use of an item to reach it. This leads to these moments where you may see a heart piece just out of reach and can't see a solution to reach it, only to then figure it out later with the right item, which leads to some pretty satisfying moments. Then there are the grottos, these strange caves you can find by entering a hole in the ground that can hold any number of things. Sometimes you may find a chest of rupees, or there could be a cow that can give you some milk, or you may stumble onto something completely different. Unfortunately, most of them aren't that great. These don't often get you great rewards most of the time, especially if you stumble onto a rupee chest with a full wallet, leading the rupees to just disappear into the void. A lot of the time, the mystery of what could be in the grotto is better than what's actually there, and after a while, finding one just becomes less of a surprise. Other secrets include fairy fountains, which are fewer but give Link pretty great rewards. These range from an upgrade to the spin attack, which increases its radius, a handful of spells that each have their own specific uses, and an increase to defense, which halves the amount of damage Link receives. And since this is technically an open world game, there are side quests to do, even though saying that doesn't feel right. There are actually quite a lot of them too. I'm not sure if the term side quest can really be applied to most of them, but functionally that's what they are. The two biggest side quests in the game are the Masked Salesman quest and the Big Goron Sword quest. Both of these quests will have you running across Hyrule, and they're both lots of fun. But the thing that will take you the longest to do is finding the collectible golden skulltulas that are dotted all over Hyrule. In total, there are 100 of them to find, and reaching certain milestones can net you a decent item. You'll at least want to find 10 of them in order to get the adult's wallet, since it lets you hold 200 rupees instead of the usual maximum of 99. Other rewards include the Stone of Agony, which helps you locate the grottos, and you can also get an even bigger wallet, which can hold 500 rupees. The Gold Skulltula hunt is pretty fun to do when you're just walking around the world and stumble into one, but I think the fun would stop if you had to scour Hyrule for all 100 of them, especially when the reward for finding them is an unlimited amount of rupees, which sure is a neat reward, but by the time you find them all, it's hard to imagine rupees ever being an issue. Then you have a series of smaller quests dotted throughout the game. The Lost Woods has a great example of this, where you can find 2 skull kids playing some instruments, and if you can play along with them, you get a heart piece. Or there's the chicken lady in Kakariko Village that's lost all her chickens, and she needs you to round them all back up, and in return, you get a bottle. It's too much! Small side activities like this help to keep the game fresh and give you smaller puzzles to solve throughout the world. There aren't a huge amount of them, but there are enough to find that you'll likely stumble on a few without really trying. But if we're going to sit here and talk about puzzles, we may as well talk about the dungeons. In total, there are 9 main dungeons and 3 smaller ones. Each dungeon does a pretty good job of introducing a concept and developing that idea as you progress through the area. The first 3 dungeons are done with Child Link, with the rest of them mostly being handled by Adult Link after the time skip a third of the way into the game. There are definitely some dungeons that are more fun than others. The child dungeons, for example, are all pretty forgettable since they aren't very complex or interesting, and if you remember anything about them, it's probably not a good memory. Okay, no, hearing this back, that's absolutely an exaggeration. That's not true. Most of the time. The first dungeon is the Great Deku Tree, which is just a tutorial for all of Ocarina of Time's basic mechanics like block pushing, timed puzzles, and using items. This dungeon is here purely to acclimate you to the game, so it's very linear, small, and doesn't give you too much to do. Then there's Dodongo's Cavern, which is admittedly a small step up in complexity. You're introduced to the dungeon with this massive room, and here there are multiple doorways and paths, but quickly you'll realize that there's still only one way to go. Dodongo's Cavern is still very linear, with a few places to explore within, but it serves as a nice tutorial in navigating larger dungeon spaces. Then there's Great Jabu Jabu, which is fine. It's the first dungeon with a core gimmick where you have to carry Princess Ruto around the place to get to certain parts of the dungeon. She's mainly used to press switches down so Link can get into the next room. I think structurally it makes sense, but the design of the dungeon makes navigation pretty confusing. The fleshy textures of Jabu Jamu's stomach tend to make most areas look the same, and since it doesn't match the game's visual language inside dungeons before, or frankly after this point, it makes Jabu Jabu an outlier. It's not a bad dungeon, but the confusing layout mixed with the weird design choices don't make it great. The bosses in these first 3 dungeons aren't anything too spectacular either. Goma is a very simple boss fight, but since it's the first one in the game, that makes sense. King Dodongo is way too simple for me, since you just toss a bomb in its mouth and hit it a few times with your sword, and that's it. And Baronade is honestly a very cool fight, and the first major challenge you'll find in the early part of the game. Link has to carefully avoid its spinning electrified jellyfish things while looking for an opening to throw the boomerang and strike with the sword. It's actually very cool. Dungeons really come into their own during the adult portion of the game. The Forest Temple is the first you'll do here, and this is still a really fun temple to go through. It's here that small keys and truly branching pathways are introduced. Some paths can loop back around to other parts of the dungeon, and it makes getting lost pretty easily. But honestly, it's fun to have a dungeon that actually makes you think about what you're doing. It's also got a cool core mechanic where you're hunting down 4 ghosts in order to make the elevator to the boss room work. And the boss here is a very good one. Phantom Ganon is a puppet version of the big bad himself, and a precursor to the actual fight at the end of the game. The small arena does make the fight kind of awkward though, and it can be hard to properly track him down while wrestling with the camera. Building on the ideas from the Forest Temple, the Fire Temple is also a fantastic dungeon. Here, Link needs to rescue all of the Gorons held captive by Ganondorf, and each one you rescue gives you a hint about the area. Neat puzzles, a cool aesthetic, and finding a big hammer make this a great dungeon. And the fact that Volvagia's fight is just a fiery version of Whack-A-Mole is brilliant. The game then takes an interesting turn for the next dungeon, which is the Water Temple, but before you can go there, you need to get the Iron Boots located in the Ice Cavern. It's just a small dungeon with some unique puzzles that go along with the ice theme. I especially love the puzzle where Link pushes a block across a sheet of ice, having to avoid getting the block stuck or lost. Overall, this is a tiny part of the game, but one that does stick with you. The Water Temple is infamous for being a confusing mess that confused everyone when they were a kid, and I think it may be the best dungeon in Ocarina of Time. The intricate design of having to raise the water level to reach different paths of the dungeon keep exploration interesting. It's also a true test of learning the environment and keeping in mind where certain locked doors and chests are. It's also home to one of the best mini-bosses in the series with Dark Link, although that final boss against Morpha sucks big time. You have to use the long shot to drag it out of the water, and half the time it doesn't grab him. Or you do grab him, but you're too close to the ledge and it ends up back in the water. I did not expect to walk away from this game with the water temple as my favorite dungeon, but if that's not evidence of how wrong people are most of the time, then I don't know what is. Unfortunately, the next couple of dungeons aren't incredible. The next stop is the well in Kakariko Village to get the Lens of Truth. It lets Link see hidden objects and false walls, which is pretty cool. A cooler twist is that the well is blocked up as an adult, but it still flowed 7 years ago, so we have to go back in time to get the item. The well is fine as a mini dungeon, but apart from being kinda spooky, there's not much interesting to say. The entire gimmick of both the well and the Shadow Temple revolves around the Lens of Truth, but these areas don't really do anything else that's very interesting. You also get the hover boots in the Shadow Temple, which are cool, but aren't used much for more than a couple of situations. They're more useful for reaching tricky ledges in the overworld, honestly. And Bongo Bongo is a pretty boring boss that doesn't ask you to do too much apart from dodge one attack and then slap it around a few times. The last of the core dungeons is the Spirit Temple, but before we get there, we need to infiltrate the Gerudo Fortress. And honestly, I'm not sure if I like this segment at all. Link has to break out the 4 carpenters locked in the fortress and fight a Gerudo warrior to get the key each time. It's essentially a big stealth segment where getting caught sends Link right back to a cell that he can just hook shot out of. It's not too egregious as far as punishments go, but it just wastes so much time. Add in the fact that the fortress looks so bland and has what feels like 30 different entrances, and you've got an area that's as confusing as it is boring. The Spirit Temple is far better, thank God, and definitely up there as one of the better dungeons in the game. The coolest aspect being that you have to start it as Child Link and work through the first half of the dungeon to get the silver gauntlets. You then go back as Adult Link and work through the next half to get the Mirror Shield. This is also where you fight the Iron Knuckle for the first time, and while it's not a very long fight, it's pretty awesome to see it cleave through pillars in a single strike. Twin Rover is fine as bosses go, but the gimmick is a bit too simple for me. You just use the Mirror Shield to absorb attacks and send them back at the boss. The second phase is where it gets a bit more interesting, since you have to absorb either fire or ice 3 times, and you need to pick one or the other since the shield can't absorb both elements at once. The final dungeon of the game is Ganon's Castle. Here, Link has to work his way through several rooms that each represent the rest of the game's dungeons. It's basically a microcosm for the entire game so far, and gives you some interesting puzzles to work through. The second half of the dungeon is then essentially a combat gauntlet where you fight through some mini-bosses before reaching Ganondorf. Luckily, the developers knew they had to make these last few fights good. Ganondorf's first fight is that same game of magical tennis from the Phantom Ganon fight earlier, but now the extra mechanic is that Link has to shoot him with a light arrow after initially stunning him. The second phase is also really cool, but we'll get to that a little later on. Ocarina of Time's dungeons are varied and interesting enough to make each one feel unique. I was actually a bit shocked at how much fun I was having at some points, since my memories of them were a bit less positive. Broadly speaking, there are some issues that do make the game feel a bit less organic than it probably should, and I'm mainly talking about the reused puzzles that each dungeon likely makes use of at one point. There is almost always a room where you need to light a series of torches, shoot an eye on the wall with a slingshot or bow, or hit a switch that triggers a timer or makes an area accessible. I like the Water Temple so much because while it has these puzzles definitely, the core design tying them all together does a great job at keeping each of them fresh. For example, there's one gate that requires you to hit a switch and then quickly swap over to the long shot to hook onto a point before the gate closes. It's things like that, little tweaks on the puzzles you know, that help keep them fresh. The dungeons do sometimes give the player some opportunities to be creative too. Some walls can be bypassed with the hook shot, allowing you to get past a tricky climbing puzzle. Another example is the enemy in the Spirit Temple that can only be damaged by fire. You can either lead it into a fire in the area or use fire arrows or even the Din's fire spell to take it out. These moments are rare, and I wish that the game would let the player do more things like this. Ocarina of Time's design is incredibly linear, and that sometimes makes for a boring experience. Ocarina of Time also struggles to make its overworld as interesting as its dungeons at times. Frankly, there's just not much to see or do in most of the areas in Hyrule. The grottos and Gold Skulltula hunt were likely the best idea the developers had at giving the player something engaging to do out here, but it's disappointing to see how little there is to do sometimes. So we've spent a while talking about Ocarina of Time from the perspective of it being a pretty huge leap forward in gaming, but one that definitely tripped up in various areas. But now we're moving on to something that I think the game still absolutely nails to this day, and that's the presentation of its world and characters. Now earlier I said that visually the game was both gorgeous and at times pretty ugly, but when I say presentation I'm referring to more than just how these cave walls look. I'm talking about why the world looks the way it does and the way that it's able to tell a story all on its own. There's a certain warmth to Ocarina of Time's presentation that manages to still work for me even now. A lot of it has to do with how expertly crafted many of the locations are, and the music that elevates these areas tenfold. The simple layout of Kakariko Village lends well to the idea that it is a pretty simple village. These guys are just living out their lives here in this small, out-of-the-way town, and the pleasant music does so much to make it feel so cozy. In contrast, you have Hyrule Castletown, a lively, bustling area filled with shoppers and plenty of other people simply enjoying the day, which then quietens down a considerable amount at nighttime when all the townspeople go to sleep. It's not really revolutionary to have NPCs that come and go like this these days, but Ocarina of Time excels at these small, important details, and it makes the world feel so much more cohesive. There are so many little touches in the game to remind you of how charming these characters and world is too. NPC interactions are often funny, give great insight to the world around Link, and can even surprise you with how dark they can be sometimes. Link may be on a grand adventure to save the world, but these are still normal people that he's fighting for. It's astonishing sometimes just how many little touches Ocarina of Time has, and it's an example of how it still manages to be so impressive. But these are the brighter sides of Hyrule. So what about the not so nice parts of the world? Well, there's some messed up stuff in this game. The Great Deku Tree is the game's first dungeon, and its atmosphere is intensely creepy. It might just be me, but the song composed for this dungeon, which is also used for the grottos, is so strange? But if that's a bit too abstract, don't worry, because there is plenty of creepier stuff. The Kakariko Village graveyard has multiple graves you can push out of the way, but way in the back is the grave for the composers of the Sun Song. And in this grave, there are literal zombies just hanging out. An even better example is the Shadow Temple, and the lore for this place states that it was used by the Sheikah, the protectors of Hyrule's royalty, to interrogate enemies of the royal family of Hyrule. It's also a place that no one speaks about because of how messed up the things that went on down here are. This place is one of the darker locations in the Zelda series, and you can easily see why. But again, these are the kinds of little touches and details that make Hyrule such a varied and interesting location. Remember, there are actually two versions of Hyrule. The one we explore as Link when he's a child, and one 7 years into the future as a Link that's grown up. As a child, the world is bright, reasonably safe to travel, and adults treat you like a child. You are constantly reminded that Link is a kid in the opening hours of the game, almost insinuating that he's probably not ready to save Hyrule yet. And boy, how right they were, as the opening act of Link's quest not only causes him to lose to Ganondorf in their first encounter, Link almost literally gives Ganondorf the keys to the kingdom to take over the world by taking up the Master Sword. And I think it's brilliant that in most other Zelda games, the Master Sword is used to have this moment where Link finally becomes the hero he's meant to be. But here, when Link takes up this sword, it's actually one of the worst things he could possibly do. By taking the Master Sword, Link gives Ganondorf a way to get in and steal the Triforce, and since he was too young to wield it, the sword kept Link in a sort of stasis for 7 years. And the game masterfully makes the passage of time immediately apparent by turning Hyrule Castletown into this. At this point, it's pretty clear that both Link and Zelda made some bad decisions, and the game gives you free rein to explore this new world with a different perspective as Link as an adult. This time jump works as well as it does because the characters and world are so harmonious. You really do feel that 7 years worth of time has passed. You feel that shift in perspective even more when NPCs suddenly stop treating Link as a kid. It also represents the new responsibility that Link has to put everything right. He and Zelda were the ones who let Ganondorf gain enough power to rule over Hyrule, and now it's up to them to fix that. Ocarina of Time isn't very verbose in its storytelling, it's all pretty minimal, but when you look deeper, there's a lot of stuff going on under the surface, and it's a big reason as to why people are still so attached to the narrative. Ocarina of Time is also handling some pretty hefty themes. First off, there's the idea of responsibility, which we just briefly talked about, and you could argue that it's something prevalent in each of the Zelda games. Link is, after all, the prophesized hero that's destined to save the day. There's obviously a certain amount of responsibility that comes with that role, but I'd say that Ocarina of Time doubles down on that idea by making Link part of the reason that things go so bad in the first place. But clearly the most prevalent theme in the game revolves around the passage of time. It's about how things can change so quickly in just a few hours. Link goes from a kid wanting to explore the world with no real knowledge of the seriousness of it all to someone actively working to undo his mistake by the end of the game. You can see this idea sown throughout the game, most clearly with the whole time travel aspect, but also in smaller details too. I think that the passage of time is handled so brilliantly in this game. It's a big part of why it's managed to stick with people for so long. That simple idea of growing up is a powerful one, and something that we all have to experience at some point. And Ocarina of Time gave a lot of us the chance to experience that before the real deal. The storyline is then perfectly capped off with an ending that feels as appropriate as it does oddly sad. Link's final confrontation with Ganondorf is set in the ruins of his castle, with the King of Evil transforming into his classic Ganon form. Visually, this fight is awesome. Ganon is enshrouded in darkness except for his glowing eyes, and now and then lightning strikes, which illuminates the entire arena. And just as Link gets ready to fight one more time, the Master Sword gets knocked out of his hand. This final battle is so brilliant because it forces you to take a different approach at the very last minute. It's not difficult, you just need to use the light arrows that Zelda gave you earlier to strike his tail. Halfway through, you get the Master Sword back, and after a few strikes, Link lands the final blow. To me, this is one of the most satisfying moments from the entire series, and perfectly encapsulates how strong Link has become. But with the day saved and everybody in Hyrule safe from Ganondorf, Link now has to go back to his original time and live out the rest of his life. It's a bittersweet moment, as most players have likely spent the majority of the game in this version of Hyrule. Zelda plays the ocarina for Link one last time and sends him back to before he first met her in the garden as a child. And when Link returns to his younger self, in a rather sudden move, Navi just flies away. Maybe her job was finished and she didn't feel the need to protect Link anymore. Hopefully this doesn't cause Link to go on an entirely new journey to find her in the near future. The game then truly ends with Link visiting Zelda one last time, most likely to warn her of the future that's about to come. But we'll never know exactly what happened here, as this is where the game decides to end it. All in all, to me, this is a pretty perfect ending. It's one that feels bittersweet as the adventure comes to an end, but also one that feels perfectly appropriate. You know, playing through Ocarina of Time again and making this video has been interesting. Frankly, I came into Ocarina of Time feeling nervous about whether I'd still really enjoy it like I used to. I'm pleased to report that I do still like this game quite a bit. In fact, I'd say that I appreciate what it does a lot more now as someone who last played through it about a decade ago. From a gameplay perspective, it's hard to say that the game plays brilliantly. There are tons of awkward quirks in the movement and combat, and even accessing menus or using items feels really stiff. But it's hard to really blame the game for this, since it was the first 3D Zelda game. It would obviously take some time to get stuff like the game feel and controls perfected. Plenty of early 3D games also suffer from far worse controls than Ocarina of Time does. Hell, even some PS2 games could have taken some pointers from this. What I was more afraid of was the dungeons. Ocarina of Time has a lot of dungeons, and with that, there's the chance that some of them could have really sucked. Thankfully, I wouldn't say that any of the dungeons in the game are terrible. There are certainly ones that aren't great, like Jabu Jabu or the Shadow Temple, but even these have moments that are fun. The weakest aspect of the dungeons, unfortunately, lies with the game's habit of reusing the same puzzles. This gets really boring once you start getting closer to the end of the game, since you already know what to expect for the most part. Then there are the puzzles that just serve to waste time. Pushing a block for 30 seconds isn't fun, shooting an eye on the wall isn't engaging, and collecting the silver rupees is actually cool. I do like those puzzles. Ultimately, the dungeons could have been a far worse transition to 3D than they ended up being. I'm pretty thankful that most of them are fun and don't take too long to complete. It's also shocking to me that the Water Temple is the absolute best dungeon the game has to offer. It's just so funny. So where do I stand on Ocarina of Time now that I've played it and talked about it for way too long? Well, it's certainly still impressive in so many ways. I love its story, world, and general design, but it falls flat in some particular areas that can make playing the game now a bit of a chore. Nearly 25 years later, I don't think it's fair to keep testing whether it's still one of the best games of all time. That's an unfair metric for the game. It's 25 years old, okay? It's not the greatest game ever made anymore, okay? Back then, maybe, but now, no. Instead, it's one that I think everyone should just simply respect and play through at least once. It is thanks to Ocarina of Time that we have so many of the kinds of games that we do today. It's hard to imagine what the gaming landscape would have looked like without it. Ocarina of Time was an impressive first step for 3D Zelda and one that paved the way for so many releases to come. But next up is a game that managed to take things a lot further.